Your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley here again, back for another episode of the History of Comics podcast. This time with the third and final part of the history of the Marvel and DC rivalry. When we last left off, Marvel nearly had a chance to license DC Comics and take them on their own, claiming total victory in the rivalry, but they had lost out in the last minute due to a third party's lawsuit. Thus, with DC still surviving on its own, the company finally decided to address its messy continuity, the result of acquiring and merging so many other companies over the decades, from Fawcett to Charlton. It led to numerous problems, from stories conflicting with one another. The Atom claims he can't shrink inanimate objects in Action Comics, only to do just that thing in Brave and the Bold, both of which took place in the same month of 1974. The idea to fix all this was Crisis of Infinite Earths, originally titled A History of the DC Universe, set to launch in 1985 on the company's 50th anniversary, with the intention to create a single, clean timeline for the DC Universe. It was meant to be a company-wide crossover event like no other, and until Marvel beat them to it with the Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars in 1984. Written by Jim Shooter and drawn by Mike Zeck and Bob Layden, it was a tie-in with a Mattel toy line launched, that the story being that the various Marvel heroes and villains were kidnapped by the Beyonder and taken to Battle World, where they are forced to fight each other. Despite a subpar concept, the first issue sold 750,000 copies in May of 1984, and the last issue of the 12-issue series landed very conveniently in the same month that the first issue of Crisis came out. While DC was beaten to the punch by Marvel, they kept going with Crisis and even stated they were going to be like Secret Wars, but good. Today, Secret Wars is best remembered for introducing Spider-Man's black symbiote costume, ultimately leading to Venom. Even Marvel's own direct sales manager, Carol Callis, called Secret Wars crap, but it did sell. In Crisis of Infinite Earths, it is revealed that the DC multiverse is being destroyed by a being called the Anti-Monitor, forcing the DC heroes and villains to team together to stop it. As a jab to Marvel, one of the universes destroyed by the Anti-Monitor is a very veiled version of that universe. By the end of the 12-issue miniseries, or maxi-series, the multiverse was destroyed and folded into one single universe and continuity, along with Supergirl and Barry Allen's The Flash being killed off. But as comic book fans know, they eventually got better. The result was one of the most popular company-wide crossovers to date and still sets the standards for events. With Crisis and Secret Wars, it also set up the regular event in comic books, for better or worse, with Marvel following up with Mutant Massacre and the Evolutionary War, while DC produced Legends and Millennium. However, Crisis was bigger than that for DC, as it provided a chance to reboot their universe, specifically their Trinity: Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman. The Superman reboot was given to John Byrne, recruited from Marvel after his acclaimed runs on the Uncanny X-Men and the Fantastic Four, and another nice get for DC, having previously poached Frank Miller. Byrne produced the 6-issue miniseries Man of Steel in summer of 1986 that made national headlines and sold 200,000 copies for the first issue. The rebooted origin erased Superman ever being Superboy, along with revamping Lex Luthor from a mad scientist into a corporate mogul. In 1987, artist George Perez and writer Greg Potter were given the work of the Wonder Woman reboot, making her a more feminist character and incorporated the Greek gods into her story. However, it was Frank Miller whose run on Batman would truly make headlines. In the early 1980s, Frank Miller and Steve Gerber of the Howard Duck fame had pitched reboots of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman to DC, with the Superman revival even being called Man of Steel. Nothing came of it, and Gerber walked away from the project, but Frank Miller still kept his notes from the brainstorming session, and when DC came to him to revive Batman, he produced The Dark Knight Returns, a high-concept series set in present day, complete with Ronald Reagan as president, only Batman is now 50 years old, having retired for a decade after the death of Robin. However, Batman returns to fight crime, leading to him to tangle with the Joker's return and his old ally Superman. The 4-issue series was released from February to June of 1986, with each issue priced at $2.95, but was an instant commercial and critical success, considered today one of the best comic book stories ever told. It's personally in my top 5. Next, Miller rebooted Batman's origin with Batman Year One in February through May of 1987 and Batman number 404 to 407. With these acclaimed series for the first time in decades, DC beat Marvel's in sales in 1987. This was only one of several acclaimed works from DC in the 1980s, which also included Alan Moore's run of the Swamp Thing in the early 80s and The Watchmen in 1986, still considered one of the greatest comic book stories ever produced next to The Dark Knight Returns. Also, another book that's in my personal top 5. DC also further innovated the industry by releasing The Dark Knight Returns as a trade paperback for $12.95 to enormous sales. This paved the way for future comic book trade collections, bringing about the beginning of a brand new market for American comic books. Meanwhile, back at Marvel, Jim Shooter's aggressive management and losing to DC in sales had fired on April of 1987, with Tom DeFalco replacing him as editor-in-chief. DeFalco was tasked with reviving Marvel, which found itself in the same situation DC once was to them: fat, overbloated, while only paying lip service to quality. The company needed a shakeup. However, the solution would shake the entire industry. The excellent 1980s wasn't over for DC, however, as it would end in 1989 with Tim Burton's Batman movie, which was released that June. It wasn't just a box office success, but also a merchandising one, tying in with fast food chains and toy lines, resulting in nearly $750 million in sales by itself on top of ticket sales. Over 10 years after the Superman the movie, the entertainment industry finally realized it could be replicated, and everyone in the industry was taking notice. One person in particular is Ron Perlman, a billionaire investor who decided to buy Marvel for just such a purpose. Under his ownership, he recruited more talent and forced out more product. Some of that talent included artists like Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld, who changed the look of Marvel books for the first time in a decade, which had forced many artists to mimic the great John Buscema. Perlman even raised the comics price from 75 cents to $1 to increase profits, with no noticeable drop in sales. Under Perlman, Marvel pushed over 120 titles in August of 1993, many of them using gimmicks, from trading card to variant covers to sell. And sell they did, from Spider-Man #1 by Todd McFarlane selling 2.7 million, X-Force at nearly 4 million by Rob Liefeld, and X-Men #1 by Jim Lee at 8 million, setting a Guinness World Record for the most comic books ever sold. Plus, thanks to a royalty program, huge checks were going out to creators, along with a bonus pool Perlman awarded to the Marvel staff if they met their profits goals. Soon, creators were pulling in $40,000 to $50,000 an issue from royalties, with X-Men writer Chris Claremont going so far he bought himself an airplane. This was not so at DC, a prime example being when several DC and Marvel staff were set down for a friendly lunch, but when the bill came due, the DC editors reached for their wallets trying to parse out the bill, frustrating the waitress. In a show of omitted gamemanship, Chris Claremont paid for the whole lunch himself, proclaiming, "I write the X-Men. I can afford it." This led to an angry call from DC President Paul Levitz the next day that under no circumstances does a Marvel freelancer ever pay for a DC editor's lunch. To counter Marvel's sales, DC found itself following again, incorporating gimmicks such as a hologram cover for Robin #1. However, DC also decided an event was in order with the death of Superman, a 7-part story over several DC titles ending with Superman #75 on November 18th, 1992, and when Superman dies, saving Metropolis from the new villain Doomsday. It was a major news, and it was a huge seller. Next, they did Nightfall in the Batman comics, which had Bruce Wayne having his back broken by the villain Bane and Jean Paul Valley becoming the new Batman in Batman #50 in 1993. In return, Marvel made news with Mary Jane, Peter Parker, Spider-Man's wife, announcing that she was pregnant, though it would be mixed into the larger and infamous Clone Saga, one of the lowest points of Spider-Man's history. She would miscarry in Amazing Spider-Man #418 on December of 1996. Plus, both companies now had a new publisher to compete with when Image Comics was formed in 1992, consisting mostly of former Marvel superstars like Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld. The new publisher was so successful it briefly overtook DC in sales, though it has since settled back to third place. All the gimmicks and events led to the speculation crash in the 1990s after the comic books peak in April of 1993 with the death of Superman. A sure sign of the lack of sales was the return of Superman with Adventures of Superman #500, which featured the Superman returning to life, though it was sold so poorly that one retailer reportedly built a throne out of unsold issues of the comic. DC was sheltered by its parent company, Warner Brothers, and had wisely scaled back the events and gimmicks by this point, but Marvel continued to double down, along with going on a buying spree that included Malibu Comics, which DC thought about acquiring, and Heroes World to serve as its distributor. DC in turn contracted with Diamond Distributors, and after the crash, Marvel and all the other comic book publishers would as well, making Diamond the sole distributor in America. One benefit for retailers was through all this was that it allowed the return of unsold product within 90 days, changing the policy of a no return when the direct market was first formed. The crash did have a positive side, as the loss of revenue forced both DC and Marvel to bury the hatchet, at least briefly, and begin doing crossovers again. One of the first was The Punisher Batman in 1994, a true classic by Chuck Dixon and John Romita Jr., and then it led to the DC vs. Marvel event, a 4-issue miniseries from April to May of 1996 in which winners of each matchup were decided by fans. DC provided Ron Mars and Dan Jurgens for their side of the writer-artist team-up, while Marvel gave the job to Peter David and Claudio Castellini, an Italian artist and newcomer. The various battles featured Batman facing off against Captain America, Wolverine vs. Lobo, Hulk vs. Superman, and so forth, with 11 battles in total, the result of two godly beings of each universe challenging each other. When the fans' votes were tallied, more Marvel's heroes won over DC, leading to Marvel to brag about it, despite the contract forbidding them to do so. The surprise from DC vs. Marvel, though, was Amoglam, a series of 12 one-shot comics that imagined various Marvel and DC heroes merged together, from Dark Claw, a Wolverine and Batman merger, to Super Soldier, Superman and Captain America. The event was an instant success among fans and showed what happened when the companies actually worked together. Reportedly, the event was to go even further than that, with DC and Marvel actually swapping characters for a year, along with making Access, a character created just for the event who could travel between both DC, Marvel, and the Amogam universe, to continue. However, the plans proved to be too complicated and they were ultimately nixed. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to save Marvel, which filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on December of 1996. There are no powers at DC over this, as they were naturally worried about the state of the industry in general. However, there were also rumors that DC might be able to snatch up the Marvel books as well. Thankfully, Marvel survived the bankruptcy, and in its reorganization, Ron Perlman was forced out of Marvel, with Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad taking over. Tom DeFalco had since been replaced by Bob Harris as editor-in-chief back in 1995. During this time, both Marvel and DC had issued a strict ban on the other characters' cameo in their